Welcome to today's webinar presented by SAMHSA's GAIN Center with the support of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Today's webinar is part one of our webinar series on competence to stand trial and is titled Risk Assessment and Management in the Context of Competency Restoration. The presenter today is Dr. Sarah Desmarais, and I will introduce her shortly. My name is Lisa Callahan, and I am a Senior Research Associate at Policy Research Associates, which is where the GAIN Center is housed. Before we start our presentations, I have some housekeeping items to review. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. If you have any questions for the presenter or regarding the technology, please type them in the Q&A pod on the right of your screen. We will address as many of your questions to the presenter as time permits. We will also be conducting a couple of polls and appreciate your participation. When you see a poll pop up on your screen, please enter your responses. This webinar is being recorded and slides will be disseminated via the GAIN's listserv following the webinar. We will also notify you when the webinar recording is posted to SAMHSA's YouTube channel. A certificate of attendance will be available for download at the end of the webinar. Please note that this certificate is for personal portfolio use only and is not for CEU credits. There is ASL interpretation for this event. To view the ASL interpretation, go to Layout in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, then select Hide Non-Video Participants, and then change the layout to View Full Screen. Finally, select View All. This icon looks like opposing edges of a rectangle. The interpreters for today are Michelle Johnson and Maureen Moose. There is live captioning for this event. To view live captioning, select the Accept button in the Multimedia pod located in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. The color contrast of the live caption pod can be changed as needed. The high contrast style is recommended for best visibility. And next, I would like to introduce today's webinar agenda. Coming up next is Roxanne Castagnata, who will give some comments from SAMHSA in just a moment, and then a presentation from Dr. Sarah Desmarais, who will follow. Now I'd like to turn this over to Roxanne Castagnata, who is a public health advisor at the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello and welcome. I'm Roxanne Castagnata, and I am SAMHSA's lead for criminal justice to the SAMHSA GAINS contract. Before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Lisa Callahan and Sam Rogers for their endless excellent work on these community of practice competency to stand trial projects. As we know, risk assessment can pose complex questions that influence our work. Here at SAMHSA, for example, information published includes people at risk of suicide, risk factors for drug use among youth experiencing homelessness, and warning signs and risk factors for emotional distress. As another example, our focus in our community of practice competency to stand trial, we know that risk assessment for competency to stand trial evaluations is only relevant if the person is deemed incompetent to stand trial and a dangerousness evaluation is needed. Otherwise, it doesn't apply. The dangerousness finding after incompetency is used to decide whether the person is detained or released on bond. In an article written by Vilhoen, Vargan, and Cochran published this year, they questioned structured risk assessment is better, whether it's better than unstructured judgment. They indicate that mental health and criminal justice professionals are often asked to judge the likelihood that people will engage in future violence or offending. Jennifer Scheme and John Monahan further stated that these assessments play a central role in many legal decisions, such as pretrial detention, incarceration, involuntary psychiatric hospitalization, and transfer to adult court. Vilhoen et al. Further states that the consequences of these assessments are serious. A failure to identify people who pose a high risk could jeopardize public safety. Conversely, erroneously deeming people to be high risk when they are not could lead to unjustified stigma and unnecessary restrictions to liberty. We are very excited to have a scholar and expert today who will lead us through a thoughtful discussion to help answer some of the questions the risk assessment process poses to our work. Lisa?
Thank you, Roxanne. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Sarah Desmarais is a professor in applied social and community psychology program at North Carolina State University. Her research focuses on assessment and treatment of risks and needs associated with criminal behavior, interpersonal violence, and terrorism. She has over 120 peer-reviewed publications on topics including violence and mental illness, risk assessment, terrorism, and intimate partner violence. And she has held over $9 million in contracts and grants from agencies, including the National Institutes of Mental Health, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Science Foundation, and the North Carolina Division of Social Services. Dr. Desmarais has conducted trainings worldwide on violence risk assessment and has written reports adopted by the U.S. National Institutes of Justice and National Institute of Correction. Before I turn things over to Dr. Desmarais, here are some observations about who's participating in today's webinar. The majority of people are participating from urban areas, followed by suburban and then rural. In terms of the professional affiliations, the majority of people on today's webinar are from either a government agency or from a hospital. Thank you for participating in the polls. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Desmarais to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Lisa, so much. So I appreciate the context to set us up for today's presentation. I'm going to be walking us through an introduction to the idea of risk assessment, the context of restoration specifically, talking about different risk assessment approaches and tools, and the state of science, what we know about how risk assessment works. And then finally, I'm going to leave us with some ideas about how we can use risk assessment results to inform our risk management. So first, I like to situate and talk about risk assessment the way I view risk assessment. So I view it as a process. It's a process of identifying factors associated with threats to public safety, estimating the likelihood and severity of these future threats, then using this information to inform decisions, identify strategies that might help us mitigate those risks, and then looking at whether or not we are seeing change in risk over time. So what I think is really important as a starting point is in the work that we do, we are going to be engaging in this process of risk assessment with or without the use of a structured instrument. So it's not a question of whether we have to assess risk, but how we're going to go about doing it. So in this context, I think it's really important to start from a place of understanding that, in my view, we're using structured risk assessment instruments not to replace decision-making or processes that are already in place, but instead to inform those decisions. And this is a really important distinction from how others might view the use of mathematical or algorithmic models to replace humans altogether. So I wanted to start with that for our discussion today so that we have an idea of how we might be able to do this without it being an idea of completely eliminating the role of professionals. So I'm going to walk us through these steps and just identify specifically where I think there's a role for structured risk assessment. So this process, again, is about identification, about analyzing information, using this information to inform decisions, planning what we're going to do, intervening, monitoring how things are going, and then basically starting all once again. So it's also not an outcome, it's not a product, it's a process that we have to keep coming back to over time. Many of us, most of us, came to this work because we believe people can change and we want to help them change. So if we're saying that that's the case, we also have to acknowledge that risk very well may change over time. So the way somebody looks today is going to be very different potentially from the way that they look in the future, which means that we have to come back and see how they're doing and understand their current risk again over and over time. So I see the role of risk assessment filling in this first couple of steps here. So the idea that we can use risk assessment tools to help us identify and analyze what we think is going on for this individual. We can also use it, depending on the kind of instrument that you use, to inform our risk management strategies. And that is where I think there are specific concrete steps that we can use risk assessment to augment the process that's already in place that's going to happen no matter what. So let's think about this in the context of competency restoration specifically. So there's a lot of work that's happening by many of you, including some of the speakers we've already had today, to address these issues that I have on the slide in front of us. We have high rates of referral for competence to stand trial evaluation and restoration processes. We have very long waits in jail. We see psychiatric decompensation. We're seeing significant social and economic impacts, delays in criminal justice proceedings, negative impacts on due process for those individual cases, and very high system costs. So I think we'd all be in agreement that there's a critical need for an improved system response. So referencing the great work that SAMHSA's Gain Center has done so far, we're really talking about two potential opportunities or intercepts at which we're going to be looking at what an individual's risk is. And here I am specifically thinking about risk in the context of public safety. So we're looking at intercept 2, which is the initial detention and court hearings, and then intercept 3, where we're looking at courts and their cases. So digging in a little bit further, these really are opportunities for diversion. These are opportunities where we might be able to get people who are in otherwise restrictive settings, in settings that might not be conducive to their best care or the best outcome, and really look to opportunities to get folks into placements and settings in which they can get that care and in which we can affect meaningful change, not just in terms of their risk of recidivism or the risk of justice involvement, but also in terms of their quality of life. So in this context, making decisions about diversion, we have really 3 issues of primary concern. The first is that of competence itself. The second is whether or not an individual might be restorable. Are we able to engage in efforts that will help them return to competence? And then finally, if those first 2 things are true, where are we going to do this work? So what is the location of the restoration efforts? Is it going to be in hospital settings? Is it going to be in jails? Or is it going to be in outpatient care? So here, where I view a potential role for risk assessment is really thinking about trying to get people into the least restrictive level of care. And I hope that everyone on this call agrees in some capacity that if possible, we'd like to get folks into that least restrictive level of care. So what do we need to think about when we're doing those kinds of decision making? What would inform us in terms of thinking about what is that least restrictive level of care? So we're going to be thinking about things like the availability of beds. Are there places for people to go? We're going to be looking at things like the individual person's track record in terms of medication adherence and the use of outpatient services to prevent decompensation. We're going to be considering things like the likelihood that they'll appear in court. We're going to consider the level of risk that they pose to public safety, and importantly, not just their level of risk to public safety, but the availability of treatment services in the community and other risk management strategies that would be able to mitigate those levels of risk if somebody was placed in a community setting. So to make all of those decisions, these are incredibly complex and a lot of different issues to be considered. It really does, in my view, require the completion of a reliable and valid assessment of risk to public safety that can help inform decision-making and intervention. So for me, that's the context within which I come to the idea of risk assessment in competency restoration. So now I'm going to take us very quickly through what are the different strategies that we might use to talk about and look at risk to public safety. So generally, we can say that there are 2 very broad approaches. The first would be unstructured professional judgment. And here, this is when the decision maker relies on their professional training and experience to estimate what that individual's risk to public safety might be. Well, for more than 50 years, we've been talking about concerns and seeing evidence of problems in the research around this approach that is unstructured in nature. The first is that we see a lot of differences in terms of individuals in their training and expertise to engage in risk assessment. The second is a real lack of transparency. It is incredibly hard for us as humans to actually clearly and accurately articulate the factors that are weighing on our decisions. We might think that we know what is influencing our decisions, but it's actually very different potentially from what is actually influencing our decisions and our evaluations. We also see a lack of consistency. So both in terms of a lack of consistency within different assessors. So how I evaluate somebody's risk to public safety could be very different from somebody else's. But we also see differences in terms of a lack of consistency for the person being evaluated. So different people might evaluate that person in a different way, or I might look at different characteristics for one individual than I would for another. So this issue of lack of consistency is also going to affect some of the things that I'll talk about in a minute, but speaks to issues of also due process and consistent application of law. So the next concern then that we know about human decision-making, and we've known this for over 100 years now, is that it is incredibly susceptible to biases. This is especially true when we're in circumstances where there's a lot of uncertainty, when there's a high degree of consequence associated with the decisions, and for which there might be time pressures on those decisions. Well, that all really pretty accurately describes the context within which we might be evaluating risk to public safety. And then finally, if none of those other concerns speak to you, the one that I hope will speak to you is that unstructured risk assessment, generally speaking, on average, shows very poor accuracy. In fact, there were some landmark seminal studies done way back in the 70s and early 80s that were showing that the accuracy with which trained clinicians were evaluating dangerousness to others was actually less than 50%. So it was less than chance. So Ennis and Litwack very famously coined the term that we would be better off flipping coins in the courtroom. In other words, we would be more accurate about an individual's level of risk to public safety if we just flipped a coin, which I hope you'll all agree is not where we want to be when we're talking about very important and meaningful decisions, both for an individual's civil rights, but also in terms of public safety. So there is now decades of research showing that statistical estimates of human behavior, generally speaking, are more consistent, more transparent, more accurate, and less biased. And this is especially true for judgments of violence and crime. So we have known this to be true in research since the 1950s, and then I've included some citations there on the slide for you of even very recent studies that are still finding this to be true, and especially to be true in the context of criminal behavior. So I just want to start with this anchoring of us in the idea that risk assessment instruments were actually developed to address the limitations of unaided human judgment. So that leads us to the second category of instruments, what we call structured risk assessment instruments. And it's a little bit of a simplification to say that there really are only two kinds of instruments, because within this structured risk assessment category, there's a myriad of different approaches and strategies. But I wanted to just give you this idea of what they might look like, generally speaking. Typically, they have a set of items or a list of items that are rated and combined in some way to inform these estimates of risk to the future. There might be various methods that are used to combine and produce the score. It might go anywhere from a simple checklist approach all the way up to something very fancy and complicated that uses, say, machine learning or complicated algorithms. There's also paper-based versions, there are computerized versions, there are versions that are filled out based solely on individual records, some that require interview both with the individual and potentially with other people in their lives. So there's just a lot of different ways that this can be done. That said, they are considered the standard of practice and the state of the science when we talk about assessing risk for future behavior. So with that idea in place, I wanted to just give you some examples. I'm sure many of you on the webinar today are familiar with risk assessment instruments, but I wanted to highlight some that could be particularly relevant in the current context. And these are just examples. There are quite literally hundreds of risk assessment tools that are out there. They're not all created equal, then they all differ in various ways. So I wanted to just highlight a few here. I'm not endorsing these in any way. So here I wanted to show some that have been studied the most: the Ohio Risk Assessment Instrument, the Level of Service Instruments, the Compass family of instruments. These are all typically used and were designed to predict general recidivism, so general offending, non-specific types of offending. Then we have instruments that were developed specifically to focus on dangerousness or violence risk, whether or not that actually is or isn't identified as a crime of conviction. So those instruments could include the HCR20, the START, or the VRAG, the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide. There are instruments specifically for sexual violence risk. There are also now instruments that are specifically for pretrial risk. And now these still forecast some of the same outcomes. So these pretrial instruments will focus on, say, the likelihood of new crime during the pretrial period. They also typically or often include the likelihood that somebody will show up in court. But what is unique about those instruments is that it's very specific to the pretrial period. So only forecasting outcomes to the time of case disposition. So just to give you kind of a flavor of what is out there in terms of those instruments. All right, so moving right along, I wanted to talk now about what we know about the state of science as it relates to these instruments. And I wanted to start by maybe sharing or acknowledging the rhetoric that exists around these instruments. So there is a lot of media coverage and discourse right now, and has been for the last several years, that risk assessment instruments are unable to predict outcomes, that they're racially biased, that they're increasing punitive responses, and that they're exacerbating racial disparities in our criminal justice system. So I want to break this down and talk about what we know in the research, what the science shows about each of these issues. So here are just some examples of various headlines. Some of these you might have seen yourselves. For those of you who are looking at your screen today, there's a lot of news headlines from different places. And then there's, in smaller font, one that I wanted to read aloud to you all. So risk assessment instruments simply add a veneer of scientific objectivity and mathematical precision to what are really very weak guesses about the future. So here, the sort of overall message that we're receiving from the media and in public discourse and political discourse too is concern, and essentially is almost a call for the elimination or the abolition of risk assessment instruments altogether. So here, what do each of these concerns mean if we're looking at them in terms of the scientific evidence? So if they're unable to predict outcomes, that is a question of predictive validity. If they're racially biased, that is a question of test bias. If they're increasing punitive responses, that's a question of effectiveness. And if they're exacerbating racial disparities, that's a question of disparate impact. So these are incredibly important concerns that should be taken very seriously and evaluated using the best science that we have. I'm going to walk us through each one of these 4 research questions and share what we know so far in the data on these risk assessment instruments. So first, starting with predictive validity. This is the degree to which the assessment results predict outcomes they were designed to predict. And a subset of that question is whether they identify and differentiate between people who pose lesser and greater risk to public safety. If you go back to our process, what we're trying to do with risk assessment is really make those distinctions, right? So here, the performance metric that we look at in the research is the measure of the strength of the association between assessment results and observed behaviors during a set follow-up period. So if you recall, when we're talking about pre-trial risk assessment instruments, that would be the period from assessment through case disposition. If we're talking about violence, we might have a different time frame if we're looking at violence risk. And similarly for recidivism, that usually has a connotation of after a person has been released into the community, following a period of detention, let's say in prison or some other sentence. So there are different timeframes that we might be looking at, and that's just one important kind of caveat to remember. So this is a question that strikes me as odd, and the reason that I wanted to, share that quote with you all from one of the more recent publications criticizing risk assessment is that there have actually been hundreds of studies and more than a dozen meta-analyses on this question of predictive validity. So meta-analyses, for those of you who aren't familiar, are where you take all the studies that have been done and you put them together and summarize what we know based on those studies. So you basically do a study of studies. So I'm listing a lot of the different papers there, and these represent studies done all over North America, all over Europe and the UK, and quite literally include over millions of individuals. Across all of these studies, what we're seeing is what I would term a moderate effect size, meaning that that's acceptable predictive validity. It's not perfect predictive validity. We're not accurate 100% of the time, but we are accurate more often than chance, and at a level that experts and most of us would agree is acceptable. So a very loose analog for you would be to say that we're roughly somewhere around 70% accuracy. So that's actually pretty good. And there's a couple of reasons why that's actually even potentially better than pretty good. So most of this research is done on real people, right, that are going through various systems and are being released into the community. Well, there's no circumstance in which I can envision a system or a community saying, you know what, let's let all of these people out and not actually put strategies in place to mitigate their risk. So these levels of predictive validity are being found even with these mitigating factors put in place, which means from a statistical point of view that we're finding effect sizes that are attenuated or that are made smaller than because of those risk levels. So in essence, what I'm arguing is that, in fact, we might actually have much better predictive validity than moderate because of those things that we're doing in practice. The second thing that I wanted to say about what we know from all of this research is that they are still better than unaided human judgments. So when the question of kind of performance metrics comes up, it's always a question of in relation to what? So are we doing better than when folks make risk estimates without a structured risk assessment tool? The answer is yes. So that's that question of, do these things predict the outcomes they're supposed to predict? The second question is whether they do so with equal accuracy for different groups of people. And so test bias really does depend on the quality and the accuracy of the estimates that we're talking about with these risk assessment instruments will depend on the quality, availability, and accuracy of information going in. So it very truly is a case where if we have bias going in, we could also have bias coming out, right? So some examples here that we might be able to understand how and why that could happen is things like age of first arrest, prior violent convictions. There's a lot of research to suggest that those metrics are biased against certain groups of people. So if you're using a risk assessment instrument that relies heavily on that information, then we might see that there are differences in predictive validity between groups. I will say that that doesn't mean you don't necessarily use an instrument that has those variables. You just don't want them to rely heavily or exclusively on that information. And the reason that this is an important distinction here is there's a lot of discussion of racist algorithms, and it's within a context of a broader discussion of our systems. And so what we're seeing is that if these data are actually accurately representing practices, then the algorithms are performing in different ways across groups, not because the algorithm is racist, but rather the system is racist. So my colleagues and I have been talking about this, and it's an incredibly important issue, but we've been talking about it in a way that the risk assessment instruments, the algorithms, whether kind of structured risk assessment tool is being used, might actually be that canary in the coal mine. So in other words, if you're seeing differences in risk assessment results between groups, it's not necessarily a result of the tool, but might indicate that there's practices in your community that need to be looked at. So that's just an explanation on test bias, but what do we see in the research on this? We actually have several peer-reviewed studies now that look specifically at differences in predictive validity as a function of race ethnicity. And I'm highlighting that particular distinction here for today. We do see some differences between groups, but they're not actually consistently in the anticipated direction. So the concern is typically that we're seeing poorer accuracy for people of color compared to white people. Well, that's not always the case. We're also seeing incredibly small differences. So when we're seeing differences in the predictive validity, it's actually to such a degree that you might not even think that it's practically meaningful. And it's quite frankly something that I would argue frequently, not always, but frequently. So for example, we're sometimes seeing differences in accuracy of 70% versus 71%. And then there's a discussion, and it's a jurisdiction decision really, of is that different enough for us to be concerned? And then finally, what we see is that even when there are differences, there is still good predictive validity, meaning that even if there's a difference between 70 and 71%, that is actually still way better than and more accurate than if we weren't using a risk assessment instrument. So it's still more accurate, and I would argue less biased than unaided human judgment. The last bullet point here is talking about the relationship between assessment results and recidivism. And this is the definition that the standards for educational and psychological testing use to identify test bias. And what we're seeing across a lot of studies now is that the average risk score relates to the average recidivism rate in the same way across groups, which in other words indicates to us that there is no test bias in a given risk assessment instrument. Another important distinction that I want to make is that even if you find, say, a difference between 70 and 71%, or maybe there's a bigger difference, maybe it's 65% and 70%, that doesn't mean that there's actually going to be systemic disparities that come out of the use of the tool. So I'm going to return to that idea in a minute. So if you'll recall, the third thing that we were looking at in terms of the research evidence is that, or concerns, is that they're increasing the punitive response. So this is a question of effectiveness. So to affect outcomes, assessment results actually have to be used to inform those decisions, right? Go back to my process slide, and we have to actually use the information to change or inform what we were going to do with the individual. Well, what do we know about the use of risk assessment instruments in practice? There's quite a lot of research that says judges and others don't always or sometimes often use assessment results in their decisions. And one of the issues I wanted to highlight, I alluded to already, and this is the idea that there need to be community resources available to manage and mitigate an identified risk. So the treatment resource hypothesis has been articulated to say that maybe the risk assessment instruments indicated that this individual would probably be okay in the community, but that particular judge or other decision maker didn't feel like there were the resources in that community to manage that risk. So that said, what we do see in the research is that as adherence to the risk assessment results increases, so do improvements in outcome. This means that we see with increased adherence to risk assessment results, we see reductions in restrictive placements. We see increased match between the interventions and an individual's actual risks and needs. And then ultimately, we also see that there are reductions in violence in the community and recidivism. So the key here is that for a risk assessment instrument to be, with air quotes here, effective, what we need to do is actually use the results of the risk assessment tools. You can't just implement a risk assessment tool and then ignore its results. Now, the fourth concern was whether or not risk assessment tools are increasing disparities in our systems. So disparate impact refers to when decisions are more punitive or lenient as a function of group membership. So an example would be that Black people are less likely to be diverted than white people. To establish that risk assessment instruments actually exacerbate current conditions, you have to show that risk assessment informed decisions are more punitive for people of color compared to decisions that are not risk assessment informed. So the example would be that Black people are less likely to be diverted than white people once that risk assessment instrument has been implemented. So you have to compare the decisions with and without instruments and then across groups. So what do we know in the research on this question or issue of disparate impact? Well, there's a few key findings. The first is that risk assessment instruments inform less restrictive conditions for people of color and white people compared to decisions that don't use risk assessment results. So in other words, we're seeing a less punitive response as a result of the use of risk assessment instruments. We find very limited evidence that risk assessment informed decisions are more restrictive specifically for people of color than decisions about them that are not informed by risk assessment instruments. And then we also find, again, that adherence is key. So there is some evidence that decision makers are more willing to adhere to risk assessment results for white people than people of color, but that's an incredibly important area of examination and continued study. So on that last point, in other words, judges and others are willing to follow the results of risk assessment instruments that say this individual could go into a less restrictive environment when it's a person, somebody who is white as opposed to a person of color. So these are important concerns, but taking everything together, what we find for those 4 issues is that risk assessment instruments show good, not poor predictive validity, that they have limited, if any, predictive bias, that they're actually contributing to less restrictive decisions, and that they're not showing disparate impact. So in studies that are actually using appropriate and rigorous scientific methods, we're finding that risk assessment instruments are contributing to the goals of getting individuals into the least restrictive environment possible. So I will also say that despite this evidence, it's not the case that risk assessment instruments are going to solve all our problems. I really like this quote from the Partnership on AI. Where they land and where I land is that risk assessment tools may not achieve a defined notion of fairness, but rather be comparatively better than the status quo. And that importance of considering what is going to happen without risk assessment instruments is key, right? So going back through all of the work that I've talked about and discussed so far today, we're finding that risk assessment instruments were developed to address concerns of human decision-making, and they do improve upon and address those concerns, even if they can't eliminate all of them. So with that, I wanted to move from thinking about the risk assessment instruments, the kinds of tools that we have, and whether or not there's evidence to support their use, into transition into talking about, well, how do we actually use these? Recall that I've been saying many, many times over that a key is actually using the results of risk assessments to inform decisions. So here, I've said this already, but I just think it's so important to know that it's simply not enough to implement a risk assessment instrument. You have to actually use the information if you're really hoping to find improved system response and case outcomes. So how do we do that? I'm going to use the risk-need responsivity model. This is a best practice that comes from criminology and is typically thought of in the context of corrections, but I just think that there's a lot of value in this very simple framework for thinking about how we use and translate risk assessment results into policy and practice. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the risk-need responsivity model, it's composed of the risk principle, the need principle, and the responsivity principle. And I'm going to go through each one of those in turn and talk about what I think are some strategies for us to use to take risk assessment results from the results into practice. So the risk principle refers to the idea that there needs to be calibration or match between the level of intensity and frequency of supervision and services that an individual receives and the level of risk that they pose to public safety. So for individuals who are higher risk, they should have more resources. For individuals who are lower risk, they should have fewer resources. And there is a lot of research and meta-analyses for the last 30 plus years, actually almost 50 years now, looking at this idea of the risk principle, and we find that not only is there a risk associated, or adverse outcome, I should say, associated with under intervening, meaning that somebody was higher risk than we thought, and we didn't do enough in terms of risk management, or they didn't get placed in an environment that was restrictive enough for what they needed. But there's actually also incredible problem and concern with over intervening. And in fact, we find in research that if we over intervene, we're increasing adverse outcomes. So why would we be over intervening and increasing adverse outcomes? This could look like putting somebody in the hospital when they'd be fine in an outpatient setting. This could be giving somebody 2 supervision sessions a week, plus lots of treatment sessions, when maybe 1 supervision session and 1 hour of treatment might be okay. Why would that be problematic? Why would giving people lots of resources be an issue? Well, the first reason is that we're actually increasing the risk factors. Some of the most common and well-known risk factors for violence and threats to public safety are things like anger, hostility. So how do you think somebody feels then if we're putting a lot of restrictions on them, especially if they're not needed, right? So we might actually be making them more angry and upsetting them further by over intervening, by putting them in a more restrictive level of care. What else might be going on? Well, we might actually be putting them in contact with individuals who are also higher risk and who share and present influences that are antisocial. So in other words, you might be putting an individual in a context where they're learning negative behaviors that increase their risk. What we know in psychology and in other disciplines is that role modeling and social learning is one of the most powerful ways that we change behavior. So if we're seeing other people who are espousing certain beliefs and attitudes that are conducive of crime, or engaging with each other in ways that are very violent and aggressive, well, that is something that we may pick up as well. So those are just a couple of examples of how we increase risk by over intervening. Well, we also potentially reduce what naturally occurring protective factors they might have. So if we're moving somebody, for example, into a high security setting where they don't have a lot of contact with family and peers, we might be pulling away what natural social supports they had in their environment. So in other words, the individual might not have been doing very well when we saw them, but there might have been sufficient social support to kind of help them keep it together. And by putting them in an environment that is more restrictive and gives them less access to those individuals, well, we might actually then be inadvertently increasing their risk level. Another example here is that we know that some of the really important protective factors for youth and for adults is actually doing something that they enjoy, so long as it's pro-social. So taking away the opportunity for recreational activities, for example. And again, if we are over intervening, whether that means putting them in a setting that's too restrictive, or even just leaving them or having them in the community, but scheduling them to such a degree that they don't have enough time to do what they like to do, then we might be increasing the amount of time that they're kind of stewing and increasing their anger and ultimately producing negative results. So the reason that I think of this as a really important issue in the context of competency restoration and diversion more broadly is that we tend to want to divert people who are low risk. But when we do so, we often also give them a lot of conditions. So I wanted to talk about what that means. When we're talking about the risk principles, generally speaking, when we have folks who are low risk, that means that they don't present a high likelihood of that behavior happening, right? That's literally what it means. So that also means that they probably will do very well on their own without any additional supervision or intervention. Once we get to somebody who is moderate risk, now we're looking for there being some level of focused supervision and intervention. And then finally, if we have somebody who's high risk for public safety behaviors, crime, violence, then we would be considering more intensive and specialized supervision. So there's a balance that needs to be achieved when we're thinking about the risk principle in the context of competency restoration. The first is that we want to think about the location. the least restrictive level of care for the identified level of risk. I am not saying release everybody into the community and everything will be okay. What I'm saying is that we need to consider what that level of risk is and whether or not there are community resources available to manage that identified level of risk. If that identified level of risk is low, then there might not need to be almost any community resources that are available. The second issue for competency restoration will be thinking about case management. So the frequency and intensity of services that we want an individual to be receiving in this context. And it could be a whole different slew of things. It could be conditions, supervised strategies, frequency of meetings or intervention, and then also treatment dosage. There's really no universal standards. Those low, moderate, and high kind of guidelines that I shared are really just rough benchmarks. But I wanted to just plant the seed that these are issues that relate to two different aspects of competency restoration or questions that we need to answer in the context of competency restoration, and that the concern or the issue around individuals who are low risk is actually that we might over-intervene. All right, so the second principle is the need principle. And here, this is that you should target the risk and protective factors relevant to that person. In the context of competency restoration, I'm going to argue that you should focus on not just those that are traditionally thought of as criminogenic needs, so antisocial attitudes, negative peers, but that you also want to consider their treatment needs because of the context of the decisions. In the research, we find when there is increased treatment match, so when we are focusing on the issues that are relevant to risk for that person, we then logically see improved outcomes. I'm also going to argue that you would want to do this in a way that focuses on dynamic factors, so those factors that can change, and not static factors, so those factors that may be in existence that the person can't change or that we cannot change for that person. So an example of dynamic might be mental health symptoms, and an example of static might be a history of diagnosis with schizophrenia disorder or a spectrum disorder, right? We can't do anything about the fact that this person was diagnosed historically or that historically they were placed in a hospital setting. What we can focus on is how they're doing now and where they should be placed now. And that's the same issue with proximal and not distal factors. So again, even though there's the saying that the past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, that actually only holds to a degree. When we're talking about time frames, if we're wanting to know what's going to happen in the near future, so if we're worried about what's going to happen into the next few months or year, we shouldn't be looking back to a person's entire lifetime. We should actually be looking at what is most clinically relevant in the last few months or the last 6 months. So really how the person is doing in terms of their current psychosocial functioning. And then here, I just want to drive home the point that even though the need principle traditionally in corrections would argue that we're focusing only on criminogenic, crime-related attitudes, in this context of competency restoration, there is added value of also focusing on identified treatment needs because we know for this population that improving their mental health outcomes can also both indirectly and directly improve their public safety in the community. So the final principle is the responsivity principle. And this generally is the notion that one size fits all does not work. And that makes a lot of sense, but it's incredibly hard to do in the systems within which we work. So we need to consider at population and person levels how we're going to be able to tailor risk management and treatment strategies to promote a positive response. This means, as I said earlier in this presentation, that we're also going to want to monitor progress. So we have to have specified and articulated a method through which we're going to monitor an individual's behavior, and then also be ready to change strategies over time as needed. Again, one of the things that brought me to this work in the first place, and I'm sure many of you, is that we thought and wanted that people can change, and we wanted to help them change. We wanted to help improve their circumstances. And so if that's where we're coming from, we also have to acknowledge that we might need to change our management and intervention strategies. So I'm going to drill down a little bit further into responsivity and think about general responsivity and specific responsivity. So generally speaking, we're referring to the idea here of using cognitive social learning methods with demonstrated effectiveness in changing behavior. So one of the real aspects or keys to general responsivity is to provide structure to support pro-social behavior. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that we provide structure in the form of a restrictive setting. What I'm saying is that we provide structure in terms of behavior. And so that might be something as simple as creating a calendar with a schedule, right? So that people know where they have to be and when. But the idea then is that we're providing a way that is reducing the cognitive burden on the individual and also supporting their positive and pro-social learning. The second thing that I wanted to mention here is that there's a real emphasis on the working alliance and relationship. I often joke with folks that you could do almost any kind of treatment or intervention, and if you have a therapeutic alliance with the individual, that is the best predictor of positive treatment response. So really establishing a warm, a respectful, a trusting, and collaborative working relationship. Now, this is also an opportunity, which I think is incredibly important, to be able to reduce stigma and improve equity. So I do really believe that there's an opportunity within the context of risk assessment and management to start to address some of those issues and concerns that have been raised around racial bias and systemic disparities. So here, I'm just going to highlight ideas like using cultural humility and multicultural orientations in the context of interactions with individuals to help build that working alliance, build that relationship, and again, doing so while supporting and role modeling pro-social behaviors. The second aspect of responsivity is called specific responsivity, and this is focusing both on characteristics of the individual and the environment that might be barriers or facilitators of positive treatment outcomes. So internal responsivity focuses on characteristics of the individual. So are there aspects of their functioning? Do they have any limitations? Are there special considerations that we might want to tailor intervention and use specialized services? So these could be things like culturally tailored services, trauma-informed training and services, gender-specific services, motivational interviewing, a whole host of different things. Now, the challenge then is you need to know that these circumstances exist. And again, I'm going to argue that using a structured risk assessment tool is one strategy to help you identify those things that might act as facilitators or barriers to change. The second thing I wanted to highlight here, that it's not just about thinking about the individual. We also want to think about the circumstances that they're in and the environment within which they are being assessed, and also in which competency restoration is taking place. So there might be staff skills or characteristics or even beliefs that are impeding positive change. There might be aspects of the institutional culture that is negatively affecting the individual's progress. And then there might frankly be broader policies and practices in place that are preventing this particular individual or a population more generally from achieving the outcomes that we would want to see. So there are going to be many responsivity factors, including mental illness symptoms, in the context of competency restoration. Most of the individuals who will be identified at this point in time will have current symptoms, and then some, maybe many, will have acute symptoms. And so if somebody has acute symptoms, it's not possible to do meaningful work around their attitudes or their antisocial behaviors. What we need to do is use a stepwise approach that prioritizes public safety. So in this context, we would first plan for safety and implement risk management strategies as the first step immediately. Then once we have those strategies in place, then we start to address the acute symptoms to build stability. And there could be overlap here. So, right, getting somebody on the appropriate medication plan might be one of those strategies to both engage in risk management and also to help address acute symptoms. Then finally, once we achieve stability, that's when we can start doing more meaningful work to intervene around criminogenic and treatment needs that relate to case outcomes and public safety. So it's really not something you can do all at once. And it's also something that's going to take some pretty good knowledge about how this person is doing here and now. It's also important that, again, we anticipate change in risk over time in response to intervention, but also in response to changes in life circumstances. So risk assessment and treatment plans absolutely have a shelf life. This is true of any context, but I think it's particularly important to competency restoration. So as a team or as a setting or an agency, it's going to be critical that individuals establish metrics and expectations. How do we know if there's been a change? What is a big enough change for us to care? And that might be about re-administering a risk assessment at some regular interval. And if that's the strategy that you're using, then you're going to want to make sure that you can select a risk assessment instrument that does afford detection of change, meaning that it's probably going to include more dynamic factors than static factors. And then again, you're going to want to be ready and able to modify the plan that is in place for the individual. Now, this sounds like a lot, and I mean, it surely is. I've been talking for 50 minutes about this almost. But what I want to say about this idea of re-administration or revisiting things over time, it's that you don't have to start from scratch. It's not a research study where you have to ignore all of the assessment work that was done before and start with a blank page and start over. No, what I think is the much better, the much more useful strategy is to have this interval kind of predetermined and say, what's changed for better or worse? What is the same? What strategies do we need to change? And what strategies need to continue? I will also just add here that, of course, we can have really wonderful plans. We can have all of these, steps laid out from the very beginning, and then life happens. A year ago, we weren't thinking that we'd still be doing virtual webinars. We weren't thinking that the pandemic would continue the way it does. And that is just a very concrete example of a major life event that have affected us all in very significant ways, right? So we also have to be attuned, attentive, and ready for changes in life circumstances. So with that, that's going to end the prepared comments that I had. There are all of the references that I shared with you all today are in the slides, and I know that the slides will be made available to you once we are done the webinar, I believe in a few weeks. And with that, I think I will hand it back over. I thank everyone very much. I'm very open to receiving comments or questions or reach out for further readings, if you will. But otherwise, I will hand it over for the discussion portion of today.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really a lot of great information, and there have been some questions that have come across in the Q&A. I'll just deliver them to you in the order in which they were given to me, and then if you want to circle back on any of the other points, that's fine. One person asked about, she wanted to know how COVID has been having an impact in this area, and I think she may have been delivering that to maybe the general audience, but in all of the work that you've been doing in the places you different states and communities you consulted, if any takeaways that you would want to pass along?
Yeah, it's interesting because I would say that generally speaking, a lot of settings and agencies are trying to get people out of restrictive environments due to the risk of community spread. So there's been a lot of push in jails and in other settings to move people to other settings that are potentially less restrictive and for which there would be easier strategies for mitigating COVID risks. A lot of those agencies are doing so considering charges of conviction or charges of arrest. Other places have put risk assessment instruments into place to help inform those decisions. So it's really been a real mix. And I think what's going to be interesting is to see how many of those changes are COVID specific, and then how many of those kind of persist over time. But I've certainly received a lot more questions in the last year since the COVID kind of pandemic really the gravity of it really hit us all than I would have previously. So I think there's just more consideration of how do we make these kinds of decisions when we would want to have people in less restrictive environments.
Thank you. I also would put in a plug that on May 13th from 1 to 2:30, the Gaines Center will be hosting a national webinar on the impact of COVID on particularly focusing on the competence to stand trial and competence restoration population. The people from the San Luis Obispo, California jail will be speaking about the work that they've been doing and some data they've been collecting. So stay tuned for that announcement if you haven't registered yet. I think the registration is open. The next question that we have is, what is a reasonable historical time frame to obtain context? For example, if someone with serious mental illness will voluntarily adhere to treatment when that individual has previously demonstrated multiple times that they're unable to adhere to treatment as a result of lack of insight due to their illness. So how far look back is relevant?
That's a really great question. And, I'm going to not provide a concrete answer, but I'll provide some sort of general guidelines, is that you want to look at a period of stability. So you want to see, has there been a period of stability for the individual? And then to ask yourself what has been going on for the person during that time. So it could be that you have somebody who's cycling in and out constantly, going on and off their med, has very poor insight. But, quite frankly, it might not be realistic that we ever change their insight. And so what I often talk about when I'm doing risk assessment is like, what are the more practical or concrete things that we might be able to put in place while maybe we do work over the next 5-10 years on the individual's insight. What we're seeing in the research is that the kind of looking backwards period, if you will, should mirror pretty closely the looking forward period. So if we're thinking about how the person is going to be doing in the next few months, the next 6 months, the next year, we'd probably want to look back no further than the last 3 months, the last 6 months, the last year. And I've done work specifically looking at 6-month windows and 3-month windows in terms of kind of a period of functioning. And usually that's highly predictive of anywhere up to a year or so down the road. So I hope that helped answer your question without being completely specific.
Thank you. The next question is, do you or other researchers have concerns about decision makers over-trusting risk assessment instruments as objective scientific instruments and as a result being less willing to critically examine their or others' risk assessment informed decisions?
So I will say that I don't know of a single study where that's happened. We actually see the opposite, that there's just not great buy-in, that there's not trust in the instruments. I haven't seen any circumstance in which there's been a research study, a large-scale study done rigorously, where adhering to the risk assessment instruments ended up in more punitive or more negative outcomes for the individual. Now, that said, I will also say that I am someone who believes that there's a role for professional discretion. My concern is that when that discretion is used and when they use what's called a professional override or discretion, that we often see it only being applied to certain groups of people, right? So if there is discretion only when it's advantageous to a certain group, then that would be concerning. But I do want to give a more concrete example of this issue of adherence and what I would sort of say is the problem of adherence. And this is coming from pretrial work. So there was a implementation of a pretrial risk assessment instrument across the entire state of Kentucky. And ultimately, it did not really, in the long term, contribute to reductions in pretrial detention or in addressing systemic disparities. And this was a statewide study, and what they ended up finding, if you actually looked at the data, if the judges had considered and adhered to the risk assessment, it would have resulted in a 40% decrease in the jail population. So in other words, they would have released people 40% more of the time. So we're really seeing mostly, I can't speak to individually, but on average in the research, we're seeing a lack of adherence as opposed to an over adherence. But that's an incredibly important area to stay attuned to and to keep studying.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the average length of time for competence restoration in forensic hospitals versus outpatient settings?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to. Lisa, you might know that answer.
I know that outpatient restoration takes longer than inpatient restoration. But in terms of, I believe the average is 90 days for inpatient. And I don't know that I've seen outpatient an actual number put to that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I typically focused in my work on how instruments are being used to inform those decisions. And then once folks are in those settings, how the instruments are being used to help develop treatment plans, et cetera. So no, I haven't seen anything on the data specifically to answer that question. I think maybe the one thing I would add, if I can, Lisa, is that we do know that even though the period of time is shorter in hospital settings, it also is much, much more expensive because of all of the structures and resources. It's just way more expensive to treat folks in hospital than it is to treat them in the community, even if the time frames are different.
Yeah, and in addition, the continuity of care is interrupted if they are removed from the community, et cetera. Yeah, there's lots of reasons to lean in the direction of outpatient restoration. The next question is there an assessment instrument you would recommend for jurisdictions open to using AOT as an alternative to competency restoration for certain low-level offenses to determine if they may be a good candidate?
Yeah, so I won't identify one specific instrument. I don't want to endorse any given tool over another, but I will say that there are several that are good options, and I would be happy to sort of talk more one-on-one with agencies, but there is, a handful or so, even maybe a dozen instruments that are all validated sufficiently, that kind of perform in similar ways to each other, that have good data behind them, and that could work. What I always do when I'm working with a local county or hospital or agency or, even jurisdiction more widely at the state level is to make sure that we're identifying a risk assessment instrument that matches the local needs. And that might be in terms of the cost of the instrument. It could be in terms of the resources available. It could be in terms of who is actually going to administer the instrument and using what information. So what I would say instead is to think about some of those pragmatic issues and use that to inform decisions about which tool then you would want to use. And there are some good guidelines available and resources online that allow you to compare different tools in terms of their content and their cost and how long it takes to complete them and those kinds of questions. Also in terms of what outcomes specifically you're interested in predicting, right? So public safety or general offending or violence, all of those are going to have different definitions across your jurisdictions. So another thing that I would encourage folks to think about when they're using an instrument is to look at how that tool has been validated or what the outcome of concern that it predicts is, how that's been defined, and how does that map onto your local jurisdiction and your needs.
Thank you, Sarah. Here's, I'm going to jump ahead one because it's related to the question that you just responded to. Is there a risk assessment that is designed for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities under court-ordered restoration?
I don't know of one that is that specific. I do know that there are lots of different instruments, well, not lots, but at least a few I'm aware of that have been validated for that population. And again, I'm hesitant in this kind of venue to endorse one over the other because it might be in part just my familiarity with the research on given tools. But I do know that that is a population of concern and that there have been efforts and studies specifically applying existing instruments to those contexts and seeing how well it's working within that specific population.
Okay. So one of the people on the webinar from Florida is asking if you, or I think that's probably more generally, you have a template for the competence reports from your state. And also, do you have an example of a template for updates, not the full assessment? And I don't know if you know if there's a resource of that, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one. So for the update, when I talk about the reassessment, in fact, I think you can use the same form that you use at the initial assessment in whatever that form is. So normally when you pick a risk assessment tool, it will come with some reporting template or form that it produces in terms of its results, or that you produce by filling in little checkboxes. I'm arguing that instead of taking a fresh one that's blank and not looking at the old one, that you can ask those questions that I offered and then fill in the form in the same way. Or there's software, if you're using a computerized version, it actually pre-populates it and you just go through and do a mental check to see if there's anything that needs to change. So there's no different form that I would advocate for in terms of the initial assessment and follow-up assessments, but rather that I think the process doesn't need to be as long or as in-depth. Now, in terms of writing reports on risk assessment results in the context of competency restoration specifically, no, I don't have templates, but there are principles that you can use and templates that you can draw from just generally from risk assessment. And there are different guidelines that are out there. My general recommendation is always to be very explicit. So even to say which instrument you used, what information you had available to you, to be concise. So in other words, keep it short. I don't think that you need to have a risk assessment report that is really more than a couple paragraphs. And I think that that's about as much information as somebody is going to retain. And then also I would encourage folks to consider the framing and the order in which information is presented. So what I mean by that is we know that the first thing that you hear is going to be also the thing that you remember. And the last thing you hear is also going to be one of the things that you remember, right? So this is just what we know from research on how people think and how people remember information. So I really like when I do work with communities and agencies to advocate for using what's called the SBAR method. And that's from nursing, from hospital settings. It was developed originally, I think, for ERs, emergency departments. And this was a strategy for nurses to communicate information to the attending physician. And SBAR is S standing for situation. So I would, in risk assessment, say, talk about the items that are present and to what degree. Don't talk about the items that aren't present. B in that model stands for background. So I actually would present current functioning, so the current situation first, and then the background second. So talk about how the individual is doing now, and then provide the historical context, like the history of hospitalization or history of justice involvement. But don't lead with that information, because if you lead with that information, you're creating a situation in which somebody is expecting high risk. Then the A in that method stands for the assessment. So where you give your assessment results. So what do you think this person's risk is in terms of future behavior and why? And not why, but what that would look like. So don't just say dangerousness, but what would the actual behavior of concern be? And then finally, R is recommendation. So based on this, what is the recommendation? So again, the acronym is SBAR, situation, background, assessment, recommendation. So I've worked with agencies to develop templates around that, but there's not just one template that I think has to be used or is best.
Okay, let's see. I have to scroll through these. Are there any specific studies supporting the 3-month or 6-month windows being predictive?
Yes. So I'm happy to share some of those, but I'll give one example. My doctoral student, Kirsten Johnson, myself, my colleague, Richard Van Dorn, and a few of our collaborators, we drew data from large national studies to get all together over 4,000 psychiatric outpatients. And we looked at the various timeframes of their behaviors, and we actually compared the predictive validity of their historical information to the proximal clinical functioning. And the proximal clinical functioning outweighed the predictive validity of the historical information. So it both increased the validity of our predictions, and it actually was more important in the predictive validity. And there for that group, I believe we were following folks up to 3 years off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. What insight do you have on sexual offenders and how that action predicts future behavior? If a person, the second part of that question is, if a person denies the crime, does that predict a higher rate of reoffense?
So denying, there's a lot of questions built into that. So the first thing that I would say is that the general principles hold across types of crimes. Now, one thing I will say specifically about sexual offenders is that the rate of recidivism is actually lower in sexual offenders than in other violent crime or in other general offending. So overall, the risk of recidivism is going to be lower for sexual violence, but of course, it's very serious. The second piece of that question was around if somebody's denying it. Well, now we're talking about potentially concerns related to their attitudes, their empathy, their insight. And so now that's leading me to concerns that are not specific to the sexual nature of the behavior, but rather to very concrete risk factors that relate to future concerns. So if we have somebody like that who has very limited insight and specifically is denying that that event actually occurred, I would be concerned, but I would also factor it in with a host of other factors.
Okay, what does competence restoration look like in the community versus the forensic hospitals? And is there a certain advantage of hospitalization versus community restoration?
I'll share my thoughts, but Lisa, I'll invite you to respond too as well, because I know you've done so much work in this area. So in the hospital setting, I mean, there is an advantage in my view if we have folks who are very acute. So I think that there's an opportunity for crisis stabilization. And that is also an opportunity for establishing folks on medication, getting immediate risk management in place by virtue of the setting. The actual interventions that they're receiving in the hospital setting, however, is going to differ dramatically depending on which specific hospital you're at, which state. And so it's hard to say what else would be going on there, but many jurisdictions really do focus not on completely resolving mental health issues, but stability, and then focusing on what factors need to be addressed to achieve competence, even if that individual still has mental health symptoms or other issues. In the community, it's going to likely involve a lot of the same things, but hopefully will be with individuals who have achieved a bit more stability. And it might be more cooperative, collaborative in terms of the different services, right? So the hospital is a one point, versus in the community, it might be somebody who is actually engaging with multiple different services and settings. But yeah, Lisa, I'd welcome any other thoughts you have about those differences.
Well, I think you hit on the high points, and I think one of the a number of the considerations have to do with interrupting those linkages that someone already has in the community. Chances are they're going to have spent some time in jail anyway, which is going to be an interruption, and that's in housing and primary care, family, education, occupation, etc. So that's always a consideration: is what is the impact of taking someone out of their community for a long period of time. And something we've addressed a lot in our community of practice, this is a question we've spent hours talking about over the last 3 years, is what happens in that competence restoration program. There doesn't seem to be, and some states have curricula that they use, but most states we found don't necessarily follow a particular curriculum. So it's not entirely clear what's inside that black box of competence restoration. As Sarah mentioned earlier, it's less expensive to treat people in the community, just from a fiscal standpoint. And another issue we've really spent a lot of time addressing is the systems that are in place for discharging people from hospitals back to the community vary greatly across states, and certainly vary within states by practice. And in many cases, the hospitals don't really have the discharge power to send someone back to their community. And so instead, that's part of what's causing some of the wait lists for the hospitals, because there's not as easy a pathway back as there was a pathway in. So a number of states are working on how to improve those practices so that when someone is, if they are in a hospital, they do in fact, they're returned to the community as soon as they're restored, and then their case is disposed of in whatever way makes the most sense. So it is a really, really big topic of discussion, though, for sure. Okay, I think we have time for probably one more question. And the question is, what do you think of, they refer to 730 evaluators, which is the specific New York State law with regard to competence assessment. Evaluators conducting their assessments during the same interview instead of having two separate interviews.
Oh, I mean, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I think there's lots of different ways to do it, and I would actually love to. I think that's a really interesting research question, to be honest. But I would say that for me, it's always about gathering information and whatever information we can get our hands on. And so if I'm talking about, for example, doing a really good risk assessment, ideally, I would have the opportunity to interview the individual, look back at their records, and also potentially have contact with, a treatment provider, collaterals like family, et cetera. Now, this is not necessarily the reality in all circumstances, and there's in fact many circumstances in which risk assessment instruments are used, but that's simply not realistic or possible. So I'm always more interested in the process being feasible than having the most ideal information, if that actually makes sense. Because we can do an initial risk assessment, and as I suggested, it might change over time. But for risk assessment specifically, we can do an initial one and come back to it later as we learn more information. So for me, it's not something that is a set product that gets put on a shelf that never changes. In fact, I always advocate for changing it. If you find further information down the road that would change your view of the individual, I think it's incredibly important to come back and see how that change would inform a change in risk, possibly. So it's not an answer completely on that specific legislation, but instead to say, with respect to risk assessment in particular, it's how do you get the best information you can feasibly and realistically given the circumstances?
Okay, thank you. There are no more questions at this point, so I'm going to move on to our next order of business as we close out the webinar. We told you at the outset that there's a certificate of attendance, and Sam is putting up the file transfer window right now. So under file name, click the files that you would want. It should turn blue. And I'm reading, and then the download button should turn a darker gray. When you click the download button, it should initiate the process to download the certificate directly to your computer. There's a couple of webinars coming up from the Gaines Center that I think would be of interest to people that are on this webinar and some of your colleagues. April 20th from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, there's an MAT in the Drug Courts Virtual Learning Community webinar on addressing concerns of court staff about MAT. On April 22nd from 2 to 4 Eastern Time, there is the Early Diversion Virtual Learning Community webinar on addressing the critical needs for housing and strategies to overcome barriers to improve housing access. And on May 13th from 1:30 to 3, there is part 2 of the Competence to Stand Trial Community of Practice webinar series. And this webinar is entitled COVID-19 in the San Luis Obispo County, California Criminal Justice System, the balance between managing mental health and contagious disease in jail patients with serious mental illness. Registration for all of these webinars will be shared via the Gaines listserv, so please keep your eye out for that information, and we hope that you can join us. If you haven't signed up for the Gaines listserv, then I encourage you to do that. We supply lots of important information, not to mention registration for our webinars. And here's the link. Just enter that link into your favorite web browser, and it'll take you to the place where to enter your information to make sure you stay up to date with all the Gaines Center activities. Thank you again, Sarah, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today. If you have any other questions or comments, the Gaines Center's direct contact is here on this website. And the last is covered up right now by the file transfer. There we go. And you can go directly to samhsa.gov/Gaines-Center, or there is a phone number also here to directly reach us. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.